Hi everyone, welcome to episode 79 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. My apologies for the slight delay in getting out this episode. I spent the last 2 days on an offsite trip with the Playbook media team getting more clarity on our strategy, process, and focus for the rest of the year. If you haven't done this previously for your own team, I highly recommend taking some time away from the day-to-day to think bigger and get more clarity for your team and business. Speaking of clarity, my guest for today's episode is Bill Ketelbey, who after deciding to leave his executive career in a large pharmaceutical company, he was searching for a meaningful endeavour to be involved in. That quest led him to join Biotech startup Actinogen, which has created a novel way to treat Alzheimer's, the most common form of dementia, which is the second leading cause of death of Australians, contributing to 5.4% of all death in males and 10.6% of all death in females each year. Bill is a trained neurosurgeon and, as I mentioned earlier, is a former medical director of Pfizer Australia and New Zealand, who ran all medical operations across the Australasian region. His team of researchers was involved in all phases of human research for most of the Pfizer products that subsequently came to market. Bill has helped launch household drug names such as Viagra, Lipitor, and the current market-leading Alzheimer's drug, Aricept. Bill is now the CEO and Managing Director of Actinogen, a clinical-stage ASX-listed Australian biotech startup focused on the development of novel treatments for Alzheimer's disease and other major age-related neurodegenerative disorders. In this interview, we talk about the process in taking a biotech product to market, investment opportunities in biotech, commercializing research in Australia, and preparing for opportunities. Without further ado, here is my interview with Bill Ketelbey. Hi, Bill. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thanks, Rohit. Pleasure to be here. Look forward to it.
Absolutely. So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and the business that you're involved with at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a medical graduate and went into the pharmaceutical industry and spent many years in the pharma industry, most of it at Pfizer, in fact, and was involved in developing multiple products at Pfizer, but probably one of the most meaningful experiences I had was developing Aricept, which is still today the market-leading product for Alzheimer's disease. I then moved on to a new career, and an opportunity came up to join a biotech company. It was a biotech company that attracted me particularly, again, because it was Alzheimer's disease. But it attracted me particularly because it was a novel approach to Alzheimer's disease. The market for Alzheimer's is massive. The medical need for Alzheimer's is massive. And having said that, the investment opportunity in Alzheimer's is huge. And what attracted me was that the approach that Actinogen was taking in researching and treating Alzheimer's disease was different to a lot of the mainstream approaches that have all failed. To date, there's been a string of failures. We are hoping that ours is going to be different and is going to, by taking a different approach, is going to open up the disease once and for all, because in the end, the market desperately needs, the patient community desperately needs a new treatment for Alzheimer's.
Sure. So you touched on, I was just having a look at your background previously on LinkedIn, and obviously you've had quite senior roles at companies like Pfizer. Mm-hmm. What, I guess, instigated you to want to make that switch into more of the startup space?
You know what, it was circumstance. Often life takes unexpected turns, and as it turns out, there's a lot of luck involved. Pfizer was going through a number, over the years, Pfizer has gone through a number of reorganizations, and I took the opportunity after many years at Pfizer to leave Pfizer. I had no real sense of where I was going, what I was going to do, but I knew the next step needed to be meaningful. And in speaking to people over the months after I left Pfizer, that was really my only response. I'm not quite sure what it is that I want to do, but it's got to be meaningful. And so when the opportunity came up for a publicly listed company doing Alzheimer's research in a novel area, using a novel approach to Alzheimer's, it seemed to tick all the boxes and obviously is fundamentally meaningful from a societal and a medical point of view.
Sure. So I don't come from a medical background, but I'd love to understand a little bit. So you've mentioned that the approach that you take is novel. What's novel about the process that you take, and how is it different to?
Okay, so the vast majority of research in Alzheimer's at the moment is focused on abnormal protein buildup in the brain. There's plaquing of an abnormal protein in the brain, a little bit akin to the cholesterol plaquing you get in heart disease. So as people age, in susceptible people, there's this abnormal protein buildup in the brain. It's called amyloid, or the one protein is called beta amyloid. The other protein's called tau. They clearly are abnormal proteins, and they clump together in abnormal plaques in the brain, and they become toxic. And the focus for the vast majority of researchers in Alzheimer's has been to try and prevent or clear those plaques. Now, that work has been going on for some 20 years. Billions, tens of billions of dollars have been spent, and so far has been unsuccessful. Our approach is approaching it from a different direction. What's been discovered over the years is that there's an association between raised cortisol in the brain and the development and progression of Alzheimer's disease. Now, cortisol is the stress hormone. It's the stress hormone everybody has and we need, and it goes up and down during the day, depending on whether it's morning or night, and depending on the stressful environment you're in. Obviously, it decreases at the end of the day and then raises the following day. And as long as it does that, it's not problematic. What has been found, though, is that there are a number of people, and including elderly people, where the cortisol level is raised. So the overall level elevates. If it stays high for a long period of time, it becomes toxic to the brain, and particularly toxic to the areas of the brain that are most affected by Alzheimer's disease. So the hypothesis, the idea, was identified some 15 years ago at Edinburgh University in Scotland. And the thought was, what happens if we suppress that cortisol? What if we dampen down that cortisol? Might that not have a positive effect on the Alzheimer's? They did a small pilot study 15 years ago and showed that was correct, and thought, well, that's great. And so from that point, spent some 10 years and $25 million in developing the drug that we have. We licensed it from Edinburgh University some 3 years ago, and we are now developing it on a global scale from Australia. And we're actually in the middle of a human trial now. So we're trialing our drug in mild Alzheimer's disease in the hope that we can replicate the animal data we've got, because we've got animal data that clearly shows that if we suppress cortisol in the brain in a model of Alzheimer's disease, we actually can stop the development of the disease and reverse the cognition. The cognition improves. If we can replicate that in humans, in Alzheimer's patients, we have a very substantial product on our hands.
Absolutely, sounds super exciting. I guess from a business context, so something that you mentioned was, everyone was trying to approach the problem in a similar way for 20 odd years. From a business context, there's a particular way of traditionally operating a business, and then when someone comes out with something that's unique or innovative or a different approach, there are obviously challenges in getting the market to accept that. Did you face any similar challenges in taking this new approach to market?
Absolutely. People say, where's the proof of concept? Well, that's what we are developing now. But it's interesting that when I first started developing the drug, I reached out to the academic community, the real opinion leaders in the area, to get their opinion. And I must say they were hugely enthusiastic. They equally recognized it still had to be proven to work, but they recognized the real opportunity that was on offer, particularly because so many other areas had failed. So really the thinking is we cannot carry on doing what we've done in the past that has failed and hope to get a different results, next time round. So we need to look at it differently. We've got to look at different approaches. Ours may just be the answer.
Absolutely. I think it's Albert Einstein's definition of insanity,
Absolutely.
right? So I guess what did that process look like? So you mentioned 3 years ago you licensed the drug from Edinburgh University. What were the next steps?
Okay, so we licensed, this drug had been under development at Edinburgh University, supported by the Wellcome Trust, which is a huge, big UK-based philanthropic trust supporting medical research. So $25 million had been spent on developing the drug, but it got to the point where it was quite clear that the next phase of research or the next phase of development would need quite substantial funding. So we licensed the drug, and obviously part of the commitment that we made was that we would raise capital and continue with the research. We did that early in 2015, did an initial capital raise, and then had to do the early human work. They're called phase 1 trials. This is where you prove that the drug, the body deals with the drug as you expect, the way it's absorbed, the way it's metabolized, the way it's excreted, and importantly, that it gets into the brain. Now, that was an absolute fundamental piece of data or proof that we had to show that our drug gets across what's called the blood-brain barrier and into the brain. Most pharmaceuticals that you and I take and that anybody takes don't get into the brain. Only about 2% of drugs get into the brain. It's because the brain is, from an evolutionary point of view, is designed to prevent toxins and external substances getting in. So the medicinal chemists had to specifically design the product to get across the brain, get across the blood-brain barrier and into the brain, and we had to prove that that was the case. Well, we did that. We also had to do animal toxicology work to make sure that it was safe, to make sure that it got into the right areas of the body and inhibited the enzyme appropriately. So we had to tick all of those boxes, do a number of other studies, make sure there were no drug interactions. Once we'd done all of that data was then submitted to the regulatory authorities in Australia, in the UK, and very importantly in the USA. So this is the USA FDA, and we needed to get their approval to run the trial, the phase 2 trial, the Alzheimer's trial that we have up and running right now. So all of that took some 2.5 years. Research does take a reasonable time. It took about 2.5 years. We have approval. We're running now a definitive trial to really prove that our concept, the concept of inhibiting raised cortisol in Alzheimer's patients, will improve their cognition and hopefully will modify the disease in some way.
As you mentioned, so part of your agreement was to raise the capital required to sort of continue on the research. And from my understanding, the company Bactal listed on the ASX to raise those funds.
That's right.
I guess were you? I don't know if you were part of that process, but were you? Can you speak to the decision to, I guess, Bactal list on the ASX versus some of the other funding opportunities that predated
me, so I really don't know the history or the decision making behind that. Once the listing had been done, or literally at the point it was done, and the drug was licensed in, was the point at which I joined the company, because clearly then the next key step was the development of Xanamem and ensuring that we undertook the Alzheimer's trial, and that's where I was brought in, and ultimately that's where my expertise lies.
Sure. And I guess from a startup perspective, it's always interesting to know what it's like to run a publicly traded company. What are some of the challenges of operating in that environment versus...
Well, and the other question I often get is, gee, you're at Pfizer, huge, big global corporation, and now you're in a startup biotech in Australia. It's been a fascinating journey for me. My career has taken a number of twists and turns along the way. Fantastic time at Pfizer, but time to move on. Then the opportunity to go from an organization where probably I had over 1,000, maybe 2,000 people reporting into me when I was looking after the Asia Pac region, to then go down to a small biotech with only a handful of people, obviously a lot of it outsourced, but a very different environment. Yes, it is different, but the key thing is, while it's different, while we've gone from massive big pharma to small biotech, what we're doing is no different. The research we're doing, the development we're doing, the way we do it, the quality of research, the patients we're dealing with, the opinion leaders we're dealing with, nothing is different there. All we're doing is using resources, I think, much smarter, much more efficiently, much more agile, as you can imagine. But then when you look to a public company, yes, obviously it's a very different environment, where you're dealing with investors, dealing with regulators, and corporate governance. Areas where a lot of people don't get exposure, but in the end, the processes you have to follow, and the policies and the procedures and the guidelines you have to follow make common sense. I'm looking after somebody's money. I'm showing due diligence with the way I'm dealing with somebody's money. I have fiduciary duty to ensure that I'm appropriately dealing and managing with somebody's investment in the business. And as long as you have that front of mind we've got a medical reason for developing an Alzheimer's treatment, but equally we've got a very significant responsibility looking after somebody's investment. Keep that front of mind, and obviously ensure that I use the company secretary's advice the whole time.
Absolutely. I mean, just going back to one of the questions that I guess I get asked very frequently is, how do I'm really unhappy at my job, or, I feel like it's time to move on, but I find it very hard to take that leap. Obviously, your situation where you've got 1,000 to 2,000 people reporting, I imagine your opportunity cost for doing that and taking that risk was very different to someone who's in their early 20s. I guess, was there anything in particular that instigated that for you, or what was that sort of thought process and things that made you want to take that leap?
It's an interesting question, and in fact it speaks to a presentation I gave at a medical congress just this last weekend, where the theme was around my career and how did I land up where I am. If I'd looked back on my career 20, 30 years ago, no way 20 or 30 years ago could I have predicted I would have been where I am today. I guess there are a few sort of principles that I've had always. That I started out with a medical degree. A medical degree gives you great grounding for medicine, but gives you very little grounding for the wider world, very little grounding about business, about finance, strategic thinking. I needed to get that training, that understanding, that theory, and I made sure I went out and got it. I did an MBA. Now, did I have to do an MBA? No. Did I have to do the company director's course? No. Did I have a clear plan that's where I was leading? No, not specially. I just knew that there were gaps in my knowledge. I needed to fill those gaps. Having filled the gaps, I improved. My luck improved. It's, they always say, Gary Player said, the harder you practice, the luckier you get. And you know what? In the end, the reality is, as long as you ensure that you have options and that you open up opportunities the whole time, something will come your way, perhaps that you're not expecting. And so luck does play a significant part, but you make your luck.
I love the point about creating your own luck. It's something that I really believe in. I think you can't force luck, but I think one of the quotes that I love, and I can't remember who said it, is you can increase the surface area of luck to strike.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you did in your career or ways that you approached things that you felt would increase that surface area for you?
I think as I said, I made sure that I filled the gaps in my knowledge where I perceived them, but always kept a curiosity or an open mind about opportunities that came along, and having that prepared mind, fortune favors the prepared mind. Another quote from Louis Pasteur, I think. In the end, be ready for the opportunity that you don't know is there. My joining the pharma industry was, in the beginning, was actually it was luck. I had no sense, no direction, no focus on joining the pharma industry. Joining the biotech industry, there was also, it happened to be a lucky conversation over a cup of coffee, but I was prepared for it. I had prepared myself for it. And so that lucky conversation was the right conversation at the right time. So I can't say there's magic to it. It'd be nice to think you could draw up a chart on the wall your career path and chart it along the way and tick the boxes as it goes. Be prepared for a career that takes many twists and turns, but recognize that the more you prepare yourself for that, the luckier you will get.
Absolutely. I guess switching tact a little bit, I would love to, now that you're running a biotech startup, I'd love to get your thoughts and impressions of someone who is looking at starting a startup in that phase. What should they consider, and what are things that they should, from your experience, that they should know that may not be obvious to them?
Well, in starting a startup, the important thing is to know your limitations, understand what you do know, what you don't know, and make sure you get help to fill all the gaps along the way. What expertise are you bringing? What is it that you're selling? What are you doing? Understand that very clearly. Somebody's going to invest in you, whether it's family and friends or investors in a listed company or a private company. Somebody is going to invest in you. You've got to ensure that you have a very clear investment product idea, and you have all the gaps in the I guess intelligence base and capability space. You've got all of those covered off. Most of them are obviously going to be external, are going to be third-party providers, contractors. That's not a problem. The vast majority of my support is provided by third-party contractors. It works, and I might say they are spread around the country and in fact around the world. So you can run a very successful, a very efficient business using resources remotely.
I love that piece that you mentioned about self-awareness as well. I think it's so important as you mentioned, in terms of not just asking for help, but knowing where you need help as well. It's critically important. I guess from switching tack from the other perspective of looking from the investment side, curious to understand, I guess, more from the startup space as well, but also publicly, how do you feel the appetite for biotech investment is in Australia? And what are things that potential investors, especially into earlier stage biotech startups, should be looking for?
Sure. So, biotech investment in Australia does suffer, I guess, from the size of the market. We are small compared to the US. There is no doubt a company like ours, like Actinogen, would be substantially the value would be substantially larger. The market cap would be significantly bigger in a market like the US. So one of the difficulties with a startup biotech in Australia is getting the Australian investment community to understand what it is that we have, the value of what we have. And I think that's equally a significant positive, because what it speaks to is there are some gems, some magnificent gems in Australia, and maybe they haven't yet been recognized. They're sleepers, and soon enough they will be identified and recognized, and then they will take off, as we've just seen. There was the acquisition of Aricept just the other day by Merck. We all in Australia understand the limitations of our market, but the expertise, the capability, the intellectual capability in Australia is huge for our size. So we can develop some magnificent products and businesses and investment opportunities here. They may just not be immediately recognized, but look what can happen. The papillomavirus, vaccine, and obviously Viagra just the other day.
So, Bill, obviously you're deeply involved in the space. What opportunities are there for investors in the biotech space in Australia?
Yeah, look, the investment, biotech investment in Australia, I think is very promising. We've got a number of small biotechs, obviously Actinogen as an example, and probably the best is for me to use Actinogen as a representative example. We are now currently a 40 million market cap company, trading at about 5 cents or so. If we were in the US environment, we'd be valued substantially greater. Our market cap would be significantly greater. And I think the same happens with a number of biotechs in Australia. But having said that, what it does is present very significant investment opportunities to the savvy investor, somebody who will have a look at the science, the technology. Importantly, have a look at the board, have a look at the quality of the board. And I must say, our board, I think is an absolutely first-rate board, with the experience that's been brought in with Jeff Brook, who's spent many years in biotech venture capital investment. George Morstan, who was chief medical officer at Amgen, a substantial experience in the area. Jason Loveridge, an Australian biotech investor over many years, and in fact Jason and Jeff, very significant experience in exiting biotech. But that aside, the value that presents to the average biotech investor, I think, is very substantial, because we are, I believe, undervalued, certainly on a global basis, and I would say for what we present as the future potential. The market for Alzheimer's is massive. If we're successful, if we can show that we are successful in improving Alzheimer's or slowing down Alzheimer's with our drug, we have a drug that could be worth at least $5 billion a year, if not more, in annual revenue. So there is very substantial opportunity for the savvy investor to get in early, to get in at the low valuations that we present now, because the upside is truly substantial and significant.
Again, one of the things that you mentioned was, Australia's historically has had such a strong track record in research specifically. But I guess one of the things that has been sort of talked about in the industry is how, as a country, we've been a little bit behind in terms of commercializing some of the great research and development that we do into actual sort of commercial development. Again, from your perspective, would love to get your thoughts on what we can do to help commercialize, or what needs to happen to help us improve in that area, if you think that that's a problem.
Yeah, you need to look on research and drug development and commercializing research as an ecosystem. It starts with the basic research in universities, for example. An idea will percolate up. A little bit more research collaboration will happen. Ultimately, it needs quite substantial funding, maybe NH and MRC or some philanthropic investors get involved. But it eventually gets to the stage where that research needs help, needs the bigger research, investment to develop it. And that's the situation Actinogen was in. So it moves from academia into research, but eventually we run out of bandwidth. Actinogen is not going to be able to take our drug Xanamem into phase 3. We just don't have the capability, the resources, and importantly the capital. You're talking a very substantial capital. We will need further investment, and ideally what we then need is perhaps the third phase, and that's big pharma. So this is the commercializing arm, I guess, of the ecosystem. But all of them fit together very neatly. They're not in competition. It's just passing the development, the product, the idea from one ecosystem to the other, one environment to the other. And ultimately, Big Pharma is the organization that has got the bandwidth, the muscle power, the resources, and the capital to take that idea and truly commercialize it. Now, I guess the criticism is, why has Australia not done it so well? Well, the reality is we don't really have that third arm, that big global multinational pharmaceutical infrastructure to be able to truly commercialize the research. Is it a negative for Australia? No. As long as we understand that we can fit seamlessly into that research chain, wherever it happens to be in the world, and as long as we ensure that we have appropriate IP and revenue streams that flow from that IP, I think that's great. We can't do it all ourselves, but we can certainly do a very important part in the evolution of the development of a product.
Sure. And I guess to wrap up, I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think the future of biotech is in Australia.
Oh yeah, great. in a simple word, it's great. Yes, we obviously are small, and we will always be small compared to say the US and Europe. But if you look at what we've achieved and the measures of success, we punch way above our weight, and that reflects the quality of science, the great environment we've got, the significant investment, the significant incentives that the government has in place now to enhance research and incentive and investment in research, such as the R&D tax rebate. It's very significant for organizations like us. I'm not saying we wouldn't exist, but it makes our life a lot easier to undertake quality research, early development in a drug, and take that development through to hopefully exiting into a partnership or a deal or a collaboration with Big Pharma and passing this great technology that we've got on to the next stage to take it forward to commercialize it. I mean, wouldn't it be fantastic in 5 years' time if Australia could tick off another major medical advance, in Alzheimer's disease, through the work that we're doing here and through the environment and the ecosystem that we have.
Bill, thanks so much for coming on the show and for sharing your experience and insights. For anyone that wants to find out more about you or Actinogen, what's the best way for them to do that?
Go to the website. So actinogen.com.au, you'll see everything there. And obviously the company can be contacted through the website for any investors interested in the company, and importantly any potential partners who are looking to invest in Alzheimer's or collaborate in the Alzheimer's area. It's all there, but we can certainly be contacted through the website.
Fantastic. I'll make sure a link to your website is included in the show notes. Once again, thanks for coming on the show.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Rohit.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to episode 79 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Bill, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Later this week, I'll be back with a new episode of The Hustle. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest interviews. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you at episode 8 of The Hustle later this week.